Good day and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It is for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. And in today's episode, we're slipping our headsets on and heading back into the Metaverse. Earlier this year, we began our foray into this world with a deep dive into the building blocks that could very well form the structural and economic underpinnings of the Metaverse by exploring tech concepts and IP implications surrounding Web3, blockchain, cryptocurrency, and NFTs. Today, we build on this by expanding our conversation into the most likely interfaces for the Metaverse, as well as how patentability and infringement could play out as we meld innovations between the physical and digital realms. In this month's episode, Kristen Hansen, patent strategist and software patent guru here at Aurora, leads a discussion along with our all-star patent panel exploring questions including what is the Metaverse, how do virtual and augmented realities fit in, and what does infringement look like in the Metaverse, or what might it look like in the future. Along the way, the group also shares some great tips for drafting claims around the virtual world to get around physical world prior art, as well as some pointers for avoiding split infringement for processes that are performed in a distributed manner. This will almost always be the case with Metaverse-based innovations. Kristen worked on VR and AR patents for nearly a decade, including those held by some of the Valley giants looking to define the space. We honestly couldn't think of a better person to lead this conversation. Kristen is also joined today by our always exceptional group of IP experts, including Dr. Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy here at Aurora, David Jackrell, President of Jackrell Consulting, Ty Davis, Patent Strategy Associate at Aurora, and Dr. Sophia Lee, Patent Strategy Fellow. Before joining the group, as we often do, we'd like to provide a short primer on some key concepts in this episode for those newer to the world of patenting. The first is the distinction between method and apparatus claims. This comes up when the group is discussing virtual infringement, or what happens when things invented in the physical or virtual world potentially infringe on one another. If you're a regular listener, you'll recall from prior episodes that the claims of a patent are the heart of an application and point out the exact invention boundaries of what the applicant believes she's entitled to own, specifically the exclusive rights that are or would be granted to the patent applicant. What we haven't previously discussed much is that there are different types of claims. Method and apparatus claims are two types of independent claims. While the distinction between independent and dependent claims is outside of the scope of this episode, it is helpful to understand the difference between method and apparatus claims when it comes to infringement. Method claims typically recite steps required to achieve a result and are used to protect making a product, using a product, or providing a service. They're about protecting the process. An apparatus claim, on the other hand, defines a product, device, or system, but it does so in terms of its components. Put another way, apparatus claims define what the invention is versus what it does. To prove infringement for method claims, it must be shown that an infringing party or machine performs each step in a given claim. For apparatus claims, infringement is shown by proving that a party used, made, offered for sale, or sold, or imported a product that includes all claimed pieces of a particular apparatus or product. The other IP concept that's important to grasp for this episode is something called the doctrine of equivalence. This is a judicial principle created to prevent would-be infringers from avoiding liability by simply making minor or insignificant tweaks to a patented invention. This doctrine allows patent holders to file infringement claims even when the competitor's product isn't identical to or doesn't literally infringe upon the patented invention. This allows the courts room to examine if the potentially infringing device or method matches the function, way, and result of the claimed invention, or whether the substitute plays a role substantially different from the claimed invention. As you will hear shortly, the notion of equivalence between physical and virtual worlds could play a very important role in determining infringement in the Metaverse. One final editorial note before handing you off to the panel, and it's an important one to make, especially as we begin our discussion around the interface of the Metaverse. When it comes to new and buzzy topics, there always seems to be this pattern that goes from confusion and creative exploration to unfettered and unquestioned excitement to a steep cliff of it's only cool to be cynical now. While still pretty early in the evolution of these technologies, it feels like there's been a growing sense of the latter. It's not to say that some of that cynicism isn't coming from a logical place as it pertains to the results we're seeing relative to the hype and investment. Facebook, or rather Meta now, is spending $10 billion, that's with a B, dollars a year on what some are already referring to as the Metaverse money pit. Will that investment ever pay off? It's hard to say. And frankly, many open and decentralized web advocates hope it doesn't. But in any case, it's hard to deny or question that the way we interact with our data in the digital world will evolve and become more immersive. It's no less inevitable than the evolution from the indirect way we used a mouse to interface with objects on a display to how we now interact with the digital world via capacitive touchscreens. We're closer, but it's still layers of abstraction removed. As invested persons in the innovation economy, there's a conversation worth having around the shapes this could take and how it plays out with idea protection. Some would argue that a lot of coverage around the metaverse is just to capture clicks. Others would say it's too soon to have meaningful conversation around something that lacks so much definition. For our audience, we look at this differently. In the world of IP, we think in 10, 15, 20-year horizons. Innovators define the undefined, and we intend to walk through and try to make sense of this uncertainty together. Take it away, Kristen.
We're going to do a metaverse discussion here today. Do you want to skip the icebreaker and all that since Dave's maybe a little short on time?
Oh, sorry. I think the only problem-solving thing, I was just going to bring one quick thing to everybody's attention for that, just because I think it's kind of like, I've never seen it, but we've had several fall into this hole recently. So I was going to just enlighten basically Dave, but the team too, if you guys don't recall. So, so I'll just jump in. So, we had this really weird situation where on several days, late last year and early this year, we filed big IDSs and they never showed up in the image file wrapper. And to the point where we actually got a notice of allowance for a few of the cases, and the examiner had never seen them because they were never in the file wrapper. So we obviously realized this, and apparently, leave it to the PTO to have a weird back end system where apparently stuff is, where you upload stuff or where you file stuff, things have to be somehow copied over to the file wrapper. I'm sure because maybe they don't put everything, I don't know. Regardless, we had to basically, at least I think, called into the Electronic Business Center. They had to escalate it, and it took weeks for them to locate all of this and then get it pushed over to the image file wrapper. And meanwhile, I had contacted the examiner for the allowed cases and basically said, here's our proof that we have, keep your filing receipts, because that was the proof we had that we did indeed file them and that enabled them to track them. But basically said to the examiner, here, we filed IDSs, they were timely filed, here's the receipts, they're trying to dig them up, please work with us on this. And so he had independently kind of been watching it, I think, and had emailed me separately when things started showing up on his end. But then, it took weeks. And so we had this happen across 2 or 3 clients. So it was a really strange thing. Nothing on our end that we had done, but just these IDSs had fallen into a black hole in the PTO. So just weird things, but just be aware that apparently it's the things you have to basically call EBC, and then they need to escalate it, and then they have to find it, but you have to have your filing receipts and whatnot. So fun facts.
So Ashley, did you actually, I never did ask you this, did you file SB08s or 1449s, or was it an old form? Was there anything you could track down weird like that?
No, I think, we had the most current SB08, we had, it was across, different clients too. So it wasn't even some kind of weird, because they have size requirements and stuff. So it wasn't even some kind of weird, there was a PDF in there that broke the system, you know what I mean? Because it was just across different clients. It was, as far as we know, there's nothing, but thank goodness we saved those filing receipts, because that was the one thing that we could say, well, they were timely filed. They, we had it. But yeah, it was really strange. But it happened, I said, across at least 2 or 3 different clients, and across at least 3 to 5 different cases. And different dates too. Some had the same date and some were across different dates. So it was really weird. So it wasn't even a weird PDO outage, you know what I mean? That did weird things.
Do you check EFS now? Is it what do you do to, and do you somehow check that it shows up in a certain time frame or something? How do you?
I think Elisa said she was going to start the next day going back in and verifying that it did show up. But I think this also puts a spotlight on making sure you're doing your notice of allowance checks that we all should be doing, where you're verifying that all the references have been reviewed, but even more so cross-referencing that to what you think you filed versus what's actually showing up, right? Because it's one thing to look at all the IDSs in the image file wrapper and say, oh yeah, they were all considered. It's a whole other thing to like not realize that some IDSs just never showed up, right? So yeah, it's a really weird thing. And it really just put the spotlight, like not only is there like making sure all the things are right in EFS web, but making sure that all the right things are there that you think you filed, because clearly some stuff. And then I guess, the other kind of not weird thing, but thing that we've been working on this with Dave this last week with another client, making sure that in the ideal scenario, all your PCT changes are taken care of before the national phase state. You can still fix everything after you enter national phase, but then you have to do it in every single country. So we've been setting a deadline for a month or two out from the PCT national phase, the 30-month deadline, to record any changes. So you can get that all buttoned up before national phase. So you don't have to do it in every country. Because there's also I think from a inventorship and applicant perspective, I think if things aren't quite right, then you can break priority in some weird cases. I think that's what the whole CRISPR thing was about. So 2 tidbits. And hi, Sophia. We didn't do the icebreaker because we got a tight 1 hour time frame today. Although I just saw those images and now I'm really curious.
Okay, we'll do them real quick. What is this patent?
Pat on the back.
Back scratcher.
Back scratcher.
Yeah, it's a pat on the back. It's a self-congratulatory device.
That is awesome.
And it reminded me of this meme.
When you're proud of something and nobody cares, and the guy's laying in a cake. I get it. After that wedding this last week, I really get that. Yeah, it resonates. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so today we're going to do a second discussion on the metaverse. And basically, I want to do kind of a what is it, how do VR and AR fit in, and what does infringement look like in the metaverse, or what might it look like in the metaverse in the future, okay? So historically, what is the metaverse? It's a term coined in a science fiction novel called Snow Crash. It's Neil Stephenson is the author. It was a 1992 novel. I have not read it, but basically it was about a couple of unlikely heroes who have to save the world from an infocalypse, right? So an information apocalypse.
It's an amazing book.
Is it?
An incredible book. Yeah.
Is it a movie too? Do they make a movie about it?
I think it might be being made or something like that.
I could have swore. Yeah. But anyways, I've heard good things about that too. You haven't personally read it either.
Yeah.
Well, Facebook sure liked it because they retermed them, the entire company, and they're really working on creating things for the metaverse. So it's but when you say metaverse, it's not always just Meta or Facebook adjacent. It really does mean this kind of virtual world where you have pieces and parts of the real world that can seep in and pieces and parts of the virtual world that can seep out via software into your other data. So in practice, people call this the metaverse can be like beyond the universe, a space where you can interact with virtual objects in real life and with real-time information. It's called the convergence of physical, digital, and augmented reality. So you can imagine if you have an augmented reality situation, you're likely wearing some sort of glasses or headset, and there's content being displayed either on the headset itself or in sort of a virtual screen in front of you, but you can also see the real world through. So that could be kind of a metaverse in itself. And it can absolutely be shared amongst many users. The other situation that it's been called is kind of an embodied internet, where you can experience it kind of a living virtual world with your own digital personality. All right. And often they do discuss the metaverse as having its own economy, because you can do all kinds of things, including trade information, trade money, make purchases, all kinds of things like that. So all of that's great, but really, okay, but what is the metaverse, right? And so there is a venture capitalist, Matthew Ball, who came up with a way to describe the metaverse using key characteristics. And what he came up with was this is basically a world that has a persistence, which means it unlocks technical limitations for the user to improve the metaverse's immersive nature and allow what they call a continuous virtual world, which means you can always be in the virtual world, especially if you're in that augmented reality situation where you can always view data from the metaverse while going about your regular life. And if you remember years ago, Google Glass was kind of an old product from Google that it was a pair of glasses with a little screen on one eye. And it allowed you to record and view content, basically what it would be like a mini phone, right? But it was a headset. It wasn't basically an augmented reality device. And many others have come further and created entire head-mounted displays that provide this. So the one piece was persistence, and it was being able to engage in both. The second piece of that was an interoperability, and that means basically they merge different virtual worlds and systems. So you could merge the metaverse piece, which could have, something you're accessing, maybe you're also making a purchase in there, and then you could be going about your daily life. Scaling was important. You have the ability to increase the size of the metaverse so you can connect up to other things around you. And as you can imagine, this is really, the concept is similar to merging a bunch of servers or merging a bunch of different computing devices and being able to access it all together. But because you're running differently, you're running either virtual software or you're running actual other software from the real world that bleeds into the metaverse because you're accessing it through something in the metaverse. So you could have virtual points, access points, all kinds of things. And then the other piece was economy and identity. And the fact that the metaverse could have its own independent economy and it could have many identities for many users. So if you imagine like avatars, you could have 5 avatars for one user, or you could have a work avatar and a home avatar, depending on what you accessed and what you were into and your hobbies. And then it would be both digital and physical, so it would span across many aspects of life. And that's basically what I was saying. You can bleed together many software executing systems from the real world and software executing systems from virtual machines executing in a metaverse. And they don't actually execute the metaverse, but if you're calling it the metaverse, you're having it be a piece of accessible software and you're running that software on a virtual machine, which eventually connects to and runs off of physical hardware, right? So you could have multiple contributors. You could, it could be connections. It could be commercial organizations. It could be just multi-user access for, well beyond gaming is what this man imagined. So, okay. And one of the things that's interesting about the metaverse is rules. Basically, there are no rules. Physics does not apply. You can make up your own rules. And so because eventually we're going to have people that interact, transact, own assets, build services, things, companies, they create IP, they might want to advertise, and they'll likely eventually commit crimes and may or may not need insurance. You can see how this probably requires some sort of legislature eventually. And those sorts of services and legislature will lead to an improved access point, but it can also be pretty dangerous before that point if you aren't paying attention. So we will see how that evolves. Right now, there is not a whole lot around it, and the patent office is actually still figuring out what the intellectual property looks like, what legislation will look like for that, and also what litigation might look like for that. Okay, so the difference here between virtual reality and augmented reality is a lot and a little all at once. All right, so virtual reality is when you are accessing a head-mounted display of some kind where you are fully immersed, you are not seeing the real world through it. It's likely a pair of glasses or something that blocks out the real world. Versus augmented reality, where you usually can see through. It's usually a clear display or some sort of awareness of what's going on around you, because you can view or sometimes just hear the real world, right? But usually it's more of a clear device where you can put content on it. Where this breaks apart is when you talk about virtual objects, because virtual objects and virtual content is shown in both, and it's just shown a little bit differently. And usually it's generated differently too. So it'll be 3D likely in both, but it could be 2D. And it's a little more difficult to create content that's going to be displayed and overlaid on real world content and still be viewable. So sometimes that is taken into consideration and changed, versus when you access it on augmented reality. But when you actually interact in both of these, you interact with yourself and your content, or you interact with several other users. And so this really created, I think, the basis for the metaverse. And this is where it started. This is what you could do with a virtual space. And I worked in virtual reality and augmented reality patents for almost a decade. And basically, when you look at this stuff and you claim this stuff, you really do talk about virtual objects, virtual content, a virtual world, and you use those terms, and you sometimes use those terms in your claims too, so that you can make sure you can get around real world art, right? And one of the things to work around the actual infringement pieces, which is, a user doing something as opposed to an avatar doing something, you actually write in what the other pieces around what you're doing are. So when I say other pieces, I mean, if you enhance imagery or optics, or you modify imagery or optics, or you optimize imagery of some kind, and that's part of what you're doing in order to display in virtual reality, you actually start to claim around those pieces. And so if you're doing something to enhance the imagery or the optics because it's in a virtual reality display or a virtual reality world, right? Even if it's software, because the software is causing those effects, you tend to put them into the claim, and that will get you around the same sort of effects that you would do in just a regular display, a physical display, that isn't meant for a head-mounted display device. So it's interesting how that world has been claimed to get around real-world content, right? For a long time, you could do anything you wanted to do in a virtual reality or an augmented reality claim, as long as you claimed it for a virtual world, or as long as you claimed it for display in the end into a head-mounted display device, right? Because you can imagine there are a lot of software methods and systems that display to a physical screen. But if they've only covered the physical screen in the application, and they haven't covered this head-mounted display device, you can get around that. And it can be novel for really strange reasons, right? Where it seems very obvious, but the fact that you're displaying it in a virtual situation is just different. All right, so let's talk about what method claims might look like in virtual patent infringement in the metaverse. So remember, the metaverse can be any type of virtual reality or some type of virtual reality, right? And virtual reality tends to be the most immersive as opposed to augmented, where you can peek out into the real world while you're consuming content. So method claims are really readily applied to a virtual world. Method claims recite steps in a process, and you likely recall that all method steps in a process must be performed in order to prove infringement. And so basically that means any entity must perform all the steps of your method claim to infringe that claim, right? So if that machine is a virtual machine operating on or within the metaverse, it could arguably be held to the same standard, right? Somebody was in the metaverse and they did every aspect of my method claim. Okay, so let's look at an example. This is a computer implemented method comprising loading video game object code into memory, receiving player preferences, executing the video game object code, and then displaying output from the execution of the video game object code according to the received player preferences. So this is probably obvious, but let's, for argument's sake, say, okay, these are our steps. And if you look at those steps, you really do see that any virtual machine executing in the metaverse that would perform these steps would arguably infringe, right?
That's an incredibly broad claim. Is that actually an issued claim, Kristen?
It is not. Nope, it is not. This is just an example. Like I said, it's very, very, very obvious. But, you know, you could see how you could add a couple more steps to make it less obvious and more directly related to an exact video game, and you could probably get a claim allowed here, right?
Kristen, you know what I think is interesting about a lot of different sort of computer software claims these days, I guess, fall in this category, but especially I think in this sort of metaverse area is divided or split infringement, where you know, if you have a Amazon Web Services hosting something for you, and then you're displaying something to a user's screen or head-mounted display, like you said, one entity needs to perform all the method steps. So I think, you know, divided infringement's particularly troublesome sometimes in this area, right? Yeah.
Yes, especially if you are accessing services and software from multiple components and doing that together to create some sort of other service, right? You can imagine like your Google or your Apple, who has software services and software access to certain, let's say, music, and then you have another player who maybe provides access to video, you know, so like TED Talks or something like that. And you combine that service and you begin to see different people are infringing different ways. You're combining it, and you also are forcing users to infringe on these things, which is not what you know, the user is not who you want to go after, right? You want to go after the companies who are infringing your patent claim.
I think that's where probably, you know, from a drafts person's art, you know, perspective, really thinking through from a software perspective, what are all those combinations, you know, and then how do you draft a claim that maybe, you know, like I was thinking about this from the wearables context, you know, and a wearables, which is not virtual reality or augmented reality necessarily, but, you know, wearable devices, you know, a lot of times they have sensors, but if you're thinking about it from a software perspective, you know, a lot of the processing actually might be done on some other device that's not the wearable. So then, you know, it's not really, you know, your claim isn't really sensors measuring something, it's receiving sensor data that's then, you know what I mean? So I think it's like a little bit of that, like,
well, and you
think those mind tricks.
So for drafting software claims, it never is a mind trick, because if you're drafting a software claim, you always, always, always need to know, and I cannot emphasize this enough, sit in one spot when you claim. One spot. If you are going to claim it from the wearable device, you sit at the wearable and everything is either received or performed by the wearable. It's never ever performed by something else in the same claim. Right?
I like that. Sit in one spot.
Yep. Always sit in one spot, because if you begin to claim half the server and half the wearable, you completely, pardon the phrase, screw yourself for having a useful claim down the line, because somebody else will infringe it by only doing half your claim and doing the other half that you said the server did by the wearable. And so you don't want to do that either. You don't want to cause divided infringement problems on your own side. And if you really think it's important that the server do something, write a whole nother stub claim set, another independent claim and some dependents from the server side, right? So way back in the day when software was basically server side or local side, you would write a server side claim, you would write a local side claim, and then you'd maybe pick or choose which computer readable medium claim was going to mimic either the server or the local side. And sometimes it was important, right? Sometimes you have different things that you want to give the user or trigger for display to the user from the server side, right? Or do the calculations on the server side. And that was very important because your local device has low memory, low battery, low whatever. So it's really an exercise in what makes the most sense to do this. And when I interview, I guess, software inventors, I always ask, could this be performed on the server side? And if so, how would it be different? Things like what has to change to allow your wearable device to actually do this piece, right? Or is there a situation where you are sharing processing, and what does that look like? And in that situation, you still do not want to write a claim with shared processing, unless it is unbelievably obscure and like the only way to do something. Nobody is ever going to infringe that claim, which makes it a useless claim, right?
Are you talking about, like, Kristen, from like a blockchain kind of? You kind of read my mind. I was thinking of, the whole like distributed ledger perspective, and or like, from you can imagine a virtual world, you have some kind of networking, mesh network, I don't know, kind of thing going on where, you don't want to claim it from perspective of I have these plurality of memories and plurality of processors, right? You still want to be in that, okay, what is one computer doing? What is one processor doing? Obviously it's going to be receiving data, so it's really interesting.
So if you, like the blockchain example, if you are literally the ledger and you're dealing with the ledger, you have to run that on a server or some certain device that's always receiving and checking and sending, right? They're always, or approving, right? You're never going to see a request at the server from the generating a request, right? The server would never generate that. It's always the users and the local machines generating some sort of request to access the blockchain. So just thinking about it in sitting in one spot and understanding that you just can't do that claim step that you want to put in there because it is important sometimes to the invention, and you just want to like wedge it in there and you just cannot. It just doesn't make sense. It makes it a useless claim, and it causes divided infringement that you don't want to deal with. And it really is a useless claim. If you have to get two people working together to infringe that, it's much more rare that will happen. And it's just better to claim it from the one place.
But don't you have to, from a divided infringement perspective, isn't it like there has to be some level of proof or discovery that kind of shows that one party and acted in an enabling capacity for the second party, right?
That's induced.
Induced. Okay, I'm seeing more induced.
So just divided, you can simply have two parties who infringe a claim because they each do half, and they cause maybe a user to infringe it because they each do half, right?
So it doesn't have to be any collaboration. I mean, not collaboration, but you know what I mean? Like instructions or teaching of the second party, because I think of in the simplest case, you think of, a medical device from a use perspective, right? You sell a medical device and then you have a set of instructions where you say, do X, Y, and Z with this medical device. And so that company is inducing a user to infringe because they sold the device and then they said, do X, Y, and Z with this. So then you're saying from an indirect, it doesn't have to be that teaching. It's just collectively two parties, and now those two parties would be collectively brought to suit because they whether they were aware of it or not, collectively participated in this.
Yeah, and you have to prove it. And part of that, it's very rarely that they aren't in cahoots because of the end product, right? Of what they usually offer, or the end service. But you can see how writing claims like this method claim and performing it in the metaverse could, infringe in the real world, right? This could be something where this is software. It just because it's running off of a virtual machine or running in a virtual access point, right? It still could be infringed. So the interesting case that I actually like, though, is the apparatus. So apparatus claims infringement is actually shown by proving that a party used, made, offered for sale or sold, or imported a product that includes all the claimed pieces of the apparatus or the product. And so if that machine in our metaverse situation, if that machine is a virtual version of the apparatus coded up and dropped into the metaverse and previously claimed by another system or apparatus claim, creation or sale of that apparatus could arguably infringe. Okay, and so I have an interesting claim of basically a turnstile device. And this is a device for counting users entering a predefined location, the device comprising a support leg with a bottom portion fixed to a ground plane, an assembly affixed to a top portion of the support leg and configured to rotate around the support leg. So you begin to see the turnstile, right? A gate affixed to the assembly such that the gate rotates with the assembly, and a counting mechanism that increments a count when the gate is rotated. So any virtual machine executing a virtual version of this assembly could arguably infringe, right? So here I have an example. This is actually a turnstile that is still in patent. It is a Russian patent. And the claim itself, language does not match the figure, but I want to give you a figure to assess. And you can see how this is a turnstile. This could be, let's say you are in the virtual world and you are going to enter a virtual concert, right? So enter a virtual stadium to watch a virtual concert. So the most common understanding of the term apparatus, this virtual counter device, really isn't a device at all. It really is software coded up to be imagery. And the virtual counter itself basically is a computer simulation, right? So any thoughts on how and why you would think this would infringe, dropping something like this as software in the virtual world or in the metaverse?
What I'm trying to think of is, do you think it would be a doctrine of equivalence kind of infringement versus because devices have typically have, from like a processor perspective, obviously that's a little bit different, but from an actual device perspective, there are physical elements of a claim that a virtual version wouldn't have because it's not constrained by the virtual reality. Like I think of my son's into Minecraft and they talk about how you can build anything in Minecraft, but you're not constrained by gravity, right? So in this, like your turnstile doesn't need certain things because it's not constrained by gravity and those physics of the real world. So then, I think it's really interesting mental exercise because I think it's like such a case-by-case basis, but I could see in some cases it could be, but really, like you said, it kind of depends on how they spin it up in the virtual world. Like, does it, because it's users in a virtual space, do these virtual things look like we would expect them to look in the real world? Or because it's the virtual world, do people have more creative liberty and do they make them look completely crazy and different because they can, not being constrained by physics.
Right. Now you hit on both. You hit on both kind of thought processes there. What about the hardware components, and is there a doctrine of equivalence? And we'll talk about both of those. But really, I would say that this example, this apparatus example, is kind of a literal look at device components in real space versus device components in a virtual space. And going back to the method claim, I would say it's basically a claim for displaying output, and that would infringe a real world implementation because clearly software performed on a processor in the real world for viewing on a real world TV or screen, right? And or for viewing in the virtual world on a different type of screen. They really would be the same sort of display output aspects, right? So maybe that method claim would be something that is very clear. But this apparatus claim, I think, is a little bit more dicey, where you're actually mimicking real world moving parts for the purposes of like user comfort or user viewing as they enter, and recognition of a turnstile, right? While at the same, but at the same time performing the counting steps, right, in bulk.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I was thinking similarly to what Ashley was saying, and then my mind went to the spec. So, like, if this claim in the spec, if they said the device could be physical or virtual, okay, right, a lot stronger of a case that they intended it, they anticipated that. It's part of their invention, quote unquote. But if this patent never mentions anything virtual, I think it's I personally feel like it's a hard case to make that you're infringing, because it's like, the inventors never anticipated what you're doing. So that seems a little bit of a stretch. On the other hand, if somebody tried to get this, let's say this is an issued claim, and someone tried to get this exact claim issued by adding the word virtual everywhere. So a virtual device for counting virtual users, entering a predefined virtual location, and a virtual support leg fixed to a virtual ground plane. I wonder if that would be obvious, and if this art would actually say, hey, look, no, someone's already invented that. Now you're just doing what someone's already invented in a computer, which I think there's good case law around. That's not patentable. So I feel like, yeah. Anyway,
that's a really good point.
I think you're right.
And I also wonder if this doesn't, from practitioners, you always try to crystal ball it, right? Like this is what they invented today, but like, how is it gonna? So I think it brings a fantastic point. Do you, as a practitioner, start building in like a boilerplate virtual paragraph? and by the way, all of these things can be done virtually, with or without the constraints of physics, these things could be done in a software-based implementation. You know what I mean? It makes you wonder, right? Because this is clearly where some of the spaces are heading. So I love the prior art piece of it though, too, because I think you're right. Like, I think if you're going to claim this in a software-based approach, you have to start going into how you accomplish it, because again, I think that, instead of, just what it does, right? Because you are entering that software world.
So I think the use cases are different enough that you wouldn't have to build in that boilerplate into your standard devices.
And I'm feeling compelled now.
But it's a good point if you are doing a piece of software only, right? If it's really only software, what makes it virtual and what makes it, running in bits and bytes on a hardware processor? There's really not much difference, right? When you start saying virtual, it's because it's either software displayed content or it's running on a virtual machine, right? There's a few different definitions for virtual, but software itself, because we don't see it working, is kind of a virtual thing, right? So I think doctrine of equivalence is what's going to come in these situations. And let's go through some case law on that, because, it's always a good reminder, especially when you're drafting, to wonder how else could this be done? What would be equivalent to this? Not only because you need the examples to draft, but you want to make sure you're covering the right things, right? And not forgetting something. So a couple of tidbits for some case law under doctrine of equivalence. A product or process that does not literally infringe upon the express terms of a patent claim may nonetheless be found to infringe if there is equivalence between the elements of the accused product or process and the claimed elements of the patented invention. Okay, that's just basics. Where the whole substance of the invention may be copied in a different form, So, right, going from virtual to real world, that could be a different form. It is the duty of the courts and juries to look through the form for the substance of the invention, for that which entitled the inventor to his patent, and which the patent was designed to secure. Where that is found, there is an infringement, and it is not a defense that it is embodied in a form not described and in terms claimed by the patentee. So here, it looks like we do have a hook to cover real world content or virtual world content and in vice versa worlds, right? So it's going to go all the way to the courts and juries. So you're still in a situation where it's going to be decided later, right? So you still could have a problem if they decide, it's the same form or substance, it's just software, right? We have lots and lots of people out there saying, well, it's all just software, and software's this or software's that. So if you get a judge or a set of jurors who actually don't either technically understand the differences in what's being pulled apart, which often in patent claims, even practitioners struggle with some of the understanding, right? So if you get a layman or a judge who doesn't typically do patents and patent claim language, you could still be in trouble. Okay, so some more case law. Infringement by equivalence generally requires a showing that the difference between the claimed invention and the accused product is insubstantial. Okay, so you're trying to go at it from a different way and say, how are these less different, right? How is this an insubstantial difference? So one way of proving insubstantial difference is the function way result test, which includes showing on a limitation by limitation basis that the accused product performs substantially the same function in substantially the same way with substantially the same result as each claim limitation of the patented product. Go back to the turnstile. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I should let you finish. I mean, just was thinking the way, if it's not, would a court view substantially the same way? Would they view that to be the same if it were software implemented versus physical reality? Is that substantially the same way, or is that different enough?
Depends on the results, right? If the results are the count or spitting something, then they're substantially the same way, even though one's software and one's real world, right? So I wonder if they would look at output, or if they would look at each, it's saying it will look at each limitation, but if each limitation has a certain output and each of those outputs is different in the physical case as well as the virtual case, they're going to have a hard time delineating that, right?
It's really interesting. It really is. And I think you might end up in the case where I think some of the thought experiments that I've been kind of thinking about and we've been talking about, if someone did get a claim that was virtual to something in the real world that everybody knows it's something obvious, but somehow it got through the patent office, in litigation, it might be an invalidity defense, essentially. So, okay, sure, we're doing what your claim said, virtually, non-virtually, but that you never should have got that claim anyway, because it's obvious over real world technologies. So I think, I think some of the examples, at least in my mind, that I'm saying, how would, this be equivalent to that? It seems like you can't, that in some claims, the turnstile claim, for example, if somebody tried to patent that turnstile virtually, they wouldn't be able to get it because it's something that's already well known. It would be obvious. So you're not going to be in this case in litigation, right?
But that's more the opposite way, right? That's somebody trying to get a patent for a virtual one versus a physical one. I think, the opposite though, can somebody with a patent for the physical one say infringement of a virtual one, right? It's I think your point is well taken. I think it's perfect from somebody going down the line trying to do a virtual one without something more, probably couldn't, given the prior art that exists for the physical devices. But does a person that's claimed the physical device and gotten a patent on it, can they stop somebody from doing it virtually?
Right.
It's like that weird.
And that's why it was a real simple claim, right? We don't want to add in all the bells and whistles that would make it non-obvious, because we do want to look at what ifs, right? And I really do think it'll come down to assessing function and result. And when they appear to be the same, I think you won't know until you bring it all the way to the courts. what infringes or what doesn't, or an examiner in some situations, right? Where, or an appeal board where they will say, well, this is obvious.
So, our question for the group. So given, like think about like how technology has evolved over time, right? Some of the more basic physical devices that we know of are well off patent, right? Because they were invented more than 20 years ago. Obviously the virtual world can move a lot faster, right? Software moves way faster than, just think of I think of my lifetime and how software has changed, right? But still there's going to be a little bit of this lag of, more simple software versus more complex that's able to mimic more simple versus more complex devices or real world things. So given that lag time, will there even be a period of time where there will be things on patent that software will be mimicking at the same time? You know what I mean? Outside of really, obviously if somebody's doing complex robotics in the real world and they're making them virtually, that's still happening. But from a, old mousetrap off patent, virtual world mousetrap, you know what I mean? So I'm just,
Well, I mean, I think there will, because if you think, I have one example that made me laugh years ago. It was a virtual reality video game where you were basically running a cooking stand. And so you're grilling up meat and sandwiches and packing everything up and virtually serving people, right? And in that virtual game, you had this very realistic looking grill with all the components and pieces and parts. In the game, they were grilling food, right? In the game, you had a dial that had to be turned on to get everything going. And I mean, so I think that you would overlap depending on what you're creating. Right?
So you're saying George Foreman sued the video maker. Just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, it was a laugh just to see the user,
right.
Interacting, but
yeah, Kristen, I had exactly a very similar example that just came to my mind, which was a flight simulator.
yes.
You know what I mean? Something where you could have very complicated mechanical simulations, I guess, right? Of real aircraft parts, for instance. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really tough question. I think it very much comes down to the claims and the spec and what's anticipated or not. But then, what I thought of is a design patent. Let's say an airline has a design patent to a layout for the cockpit display or whatever. And then if somebody actually copied that into a video game, especially since it's a design, of course, right? That would be clearly infringing.
Right.
But the mechanical parts of it or the methods or whatever, yeah, it's interesting. If the method of flying the airplane, let's say, was really unique and very inventive, just as a thought experiment. And then the software people creating this flight simulator used that particular mechanism. I think there would be a pretty good case for that they're infringing. It's a real invention. They took it, they're using it. Different application, but I mean, the core of the invention, the technology does seem to be leveraged,
No, I agree. And so one last bit on doctrine of equivalence and some case law. We basically have a claimed invention and an accused device that may perform substantially the same function and achieve the same result, will not make the latter an infringement under the doctrine of equivalence where the accused device performs the function and achieves the result in a substantially different way. So what we want to look at there, if the turnstile, the way you're achieving this result is it's a piece of software creating the count. In the real world, it's an actual mechanism moving, and it's probably a mechanical counter, right? And it likely isn't running software, but it could, right? So you could split an old school turnstile device from a new school turnstile device. And I think you could say the old one wouldn't likely infringe because you get this function and the result in a substantially different way than you do with the virtual content and the virtual turnstile. But the new one maybe runs some software and maybe you have more overlaps. And because they look at it on a limitation by limitation basis, you might have a few pieces that actually infringe, right? Now, they may find that you don't have all. And in that case, in a method claim, you have to have all, right? It has to perform all. But in an apparatus claim, it's not necessarily all, right? And it's not kind of a performance thing. It's just pieces and parts. And you don't always claim, even if you're claiming a software turnstile, you're not necessarily calling it, visual content or virtual content always. It's a virtual turnstile, but then you start to look at virtual turnstile versus physical turnstile. And then you go back to this other argument and you go, how about the function and the result? Right? And it's the same. So I think it's going to be dicey, and I think it's going to turn on whether this doctrine of equivalence is actually usable, from a lawmaker's view in the virtual space. I don't know.
I really like Dave. I feel like, that the design patent was a really interesting piece, because I think it'd be interesting to see if there's not that their design patents haven't been powerful, but even more so now, for things you wouldn't have thought of to get a design patent for, do you now get a design patent for more from a just protecting against virtual adaptations of it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, but remember with design patents, it may be a situation where you're looking at figures, whether it's virtual content or real world content, you're still looking at aspects of that design that match.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little easier, I think, to make those determinations and say, hey, this is exactly what this is, and it's identical, and it's displaying something, right? So it's displayed, or it's viewable. And because it's ornamental and viewable, right? It's not functional. I think those are going to be easier to prove, that, hey, you do infringe this because look, it looks the same.
Right.
Yeah, getting deep into the weeds of design patents, all the dotted lines and the environment could come into play, depending on exactly what you've designed, what you're claiming in your design versus like what's surrounding it may or may not exist in the virtual space. But it does seem like an obvious place of overlap, I guess. But I think, Kristen, that the stuff that you're talking about with the achieving a result in a similar way is really interesting. And I agree with you that, a lot of times software is going to be very different in the achieving of the process. But again, I think it comes down to the claims. Like, I could imagine a method of flying an airplane, right? Which has nothing to do with the physical airplane, which you could absolutely infringe in a virtual space.
Sure.
Comes down to the claims and the spec and everything. Yeah.
Yep, it's going to be interesting. So I think my next installment of the Metaverse, I'll cover something around solutions to patent protection in virtual worlds, and kind of what you can do in virtual worlds to protect yourself a little more as you write claims for services or content in the Metaverse, or services and content accessed in the Metaverse. I think it's going to be similar to what we do for virtual and augmented content now, but I think you'll have to abstract at one level more, because it is not just your own software that you create and display. This is something where you are integrating services, and you're dealing with multi-user access and things that normally are just provided from a server or a bunch of servers. And in this situation, you may be accessing multiple things in multiple ways that are meant to be merged and used together. And how do you create products like that and protect products like that, right?
Well, as what I'm thinking is we set up a virtual room and write virtual patents and get issued virtual patents. Just kidding. Just gonna go full on virtual.
But I wrote mine in the virtual world. Yeah, I don't know. It's, they've been doing it for decades in the virtual and augmented spaces. And like I said, some of the tips and tricks there are to use the language of the world that you're in. But often you would receive video game art or old school like Microsoft productivity patent art, things that solve these problems in a different way, but not for the virtual world. And often what you would have happen is you got 2 of those patents where a handful of your method steps are covered in these 2 older patents. And then the third piece just happens to be a virtual reality HMD device patent, and they just glom them together. And they say, well, this is obvious because this and this, and then here's a virtual reality patent that talks about maybe doing something productive, right? Productivity wise. So examiners kind of take some shortcuts there, and maybe that's okay, right? And say that this is obvious because one skilled in the art would be motivated to do this combination. And then you begin to have to argue really difficult things that, tend to go to appeal. Let's put it that way. All right. Any other comments or questions?
Well, that was fantastic. Really interesting. Good dialogue.
Awesome.
Yeah,
you all
thanks,
too.
Kristen.
Thank you. Yep. Thanks for taking part, and I will see everybody soon.
Sounds great.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Kristen.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at auroropatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion, or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@auroropatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.